Jason Chen stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the city lights twinkling below like fallen stars. His fingers absently traced the edge of a photo frame on his desk, a happy moment frozen in time, showing him, his late wife Linda, and their son Tommy at the beach. The sound of breaking glass from downstairs snapped him back to reality. "Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry, but Tommy's upset again," called Mrs. Peterson, the fourth nanny this month, her voice trembling. He locked himself in his room. Jason hurried down the curved staircase, his heart heavy. At the sight of the shattered picture frame on the marble floor, another family photo, he felt the familiar ache in his chest. 2 years had passed since Linda's accident, but moments like these made it feel like yesterday. "I quit, Mr. Chen," Mrs. Peterson announced, already gathering her things. "I'm sorry, but I can't handle this anymore. Tommy needs more than I can give." Jason nodded, too tired to argue. He watched her leave, then sat on the stairs, loosening his tie. At 42, he built a tech empire worth billions, but he couldn't seem to fix what mattered most, his own home. Through Tommy's door, he could hear muffled sobs. "Buddy, can we talk?" "Go away. You're never here anyway." Tommy's voice cracked, breaking Jason's heart all over again. Later that night, after Tommy had finally fallen asleep, Jason sat in his home office, scrolling through another agency's nanny profiles. His CFO had called twice about the upcoming merger, but for once, business could wait. The house felt too big, too empty, too quiet without Linda's laugh echoing through the halls. His sister-in-law, Rebecca's words from last week's dinner rang in his ears. "You need someone who can bring life back into this house, Jason, not just another professional babysitter." He glanced at Tommy's latest school report, straight A's, but his teacher's notes stood out. Tommy is increasingly withdrawn in class. He's struggling to connect with his peers. The next morning, watching Tommy pick at his breakfast, Jason made a decision. He needed help, real help, not just someone to watch Tommy, but someone who could help rebuild their family. Even his housekeeper, Mrs. Wu, who'd been with them for 10 years, had mentioned how the house felt like it was carrying too many ghosts. As he dropped Tommy off at school, seeing his small shoulders hunched under the weight of his backpack, Jason realized something had to change. He couldn't keep putting work first. His son needed him, and he needed help to be the father Tommy deserved. Looking at the city skyline from his car, Jason thought about how simple life had seemed before, when Linda was alive, when Tommy's laugh came easily, when their home felt warm instead of just expensive. His phone buzzed with another message about the merger, but instead of checking it, he called his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next 2 days," he said, "and contact Stone and Associates. Not for another temporary nanny. We need someone special this time. Someone who can help us rebuild." That evening, as he helped Tommy with his math homework, Jason felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find someone who would understand that this wasn't just a job, it was about healing a broken family. Looking at his son's concentrated face, so much like Linda's when she was focused, he silently promised both Tommy and his late wife that things would get better. He couldn't bring Linda back, but he could try to bring life back into their home. As Tommy finally smiled at solving a difficult problem, Jason realized that's what Linda would have wanted, not for them to be stuck in grief, but to find their way back to joy, one small step at a time. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Chen mansion as Amy Parker walked in, her simple black dress and warm smile standing out against the cold marble and chrome interior. The interview had been scheduled for 9, but she'd arrived early, taking in the beautiful but somehow lonely atmosphere of the grand house. Mrs. Wu, the housekeeper, led her to the living room, where family photos lined the walls. Amy's heart tightened at the obvious gap in their timeline. No recent happy moments, just memories from before. The sound of running feet made her turn. And there was Tommy, skidding to a stop when he saw her. "You must be Tommy," Andy said softly, kneeling to his eye level. "I heard you're amazing at building robots." She pulled out a small wind-up toy from her bag. "Think you could show me how this one works?" Tommy's eyes lit up for a moment before darting away, unsure. But his curiosity won out, and he stepped closer to examine the toy. That's how Jason found them 5 minutes later, sitting on the floor, heads bent together over the mechanical toy, Tommy actually explaining something with enthusiasm. The next few weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the Chen household. Emmy's influence was like a gentle breeze through a stuffy room. She didn't just watch Tommy, she engaged with him. They built elaborate Lego cities, conducted scientific experiments in the kitchen under Mrs. Wu's watchful eye, and started a small garden on the terrace. "Dad, look," Tommy called one evening as Jason returned from work. He was proudly showing off a tomato plant he'd grown from seed. "Emmy says we can make pizza with our own tomatoes when they're ready." Jason found himself leaving work earlier, drawn home by the sounds of laughter and life that had been missing for so long. He'd catch himself lingering in the kitchen while Amy helped Tommy with homework or joining their board game nights. She had a way of making even ordinary moments feel special. One rainy Saturday, Jason came downstairs to find the living room transformed into a blanket fort. Tommy and Amy were inside, reading stories with flashlights. Instead of checking his emails, Jason found himself crawling in to join them. The dragon was huge. Amy was reading, her voice changing for each character. Tommy was curled up against her side, completely absorbed. Looking at them, Jason felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace. Mrs. Wu noticed the changes too. "The house feels warm again," she told Jason one morning as she served coffee. "Tommy smiles now. And so do you, Mr. Chen." It wasn't just Tommy who was blooming under Amy's care. She had a gift for listening, for making people feel heard. When Jason mentioned a challenging day at work, she'd ask thoughtful questions that helped him see things differently. Her practical wisdom, wrapped in kindness, became something he looked forward to. "You know," Amy said one evening after Tommy was asleep, "he talks about his mom sometimes. He's worried you'll be sad if he does, but he needs to remember her." Jason felt his throat tighten. "I don't know how to help him with that. I can barely handle it myself." "Maybe that's okay," Annie replied gently. "Maybe healing happens when we stop trying to handle everything alone." As weeks turned into months, the Chen mansion gradually transformed from a showcase house into a home again. There were muddy footprints in the hallway from garden adventures, crayon masterpieces on the fridge, and the sound of genuine laughter echoing through the rooms. What none of them realized yet was that this was just the beginning. As spring turned to summer, the seeds of something deeper were taking root, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, love, and second chances. It started with small moments. Shade glances over Tommy's head during movie nights, lingering conversations after he went to bed, and the way Jason's heart would skip when Amy laughed at his terrible dad jokes. The shift was so gradual that neither of them noticed at first, like watching the sunset and suddenly realizing the sky had changed colors. One evening, while Tommy was at a sleepover with his cousin, Jason found Amy in the garden, harvesting the tomatoes they planted months ago. The setting sun painted everything golden, and something about the way she smiled when she saw him made his world shift slightly on its axis. "Want to help make dinner?" she asked, holding up the basket of tomatoes. "I promised Tommy we'd make his favorite pasta sauce, but he'll forgive us if we test it first." In the kitchen, chopping vegetables side by side, they fell into an easy rhythm. Amy told stories about her childhood garden, and Jason shared memories of learning to cook from his mother. When their hands brushed reaching for the same spoon, neither pulled away immediately. "You've changed this house," Jason said softly, stirring the sauce. "Changed us. Tommy's like a different kid now." Annie wiped her hands on her apron, turning to face him. "You both helped me too, you know. This job, it's become so much more than that." The moment hummed between them, filled with unspoken words. The timer's ding made them both jump, breaking the spell. But something had shifted, like the first crack in a dam. Over the next few weeks, they found themselves creating excuses to spend time together. Jason would ask for her opinion on business matters, and Amy would seek his help with Tommy's science projects. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, covering everything from childhood dreams to favorite books. Mrs. Wu noticed, of course. She'd catch the way Jason's eyes followed Amy across the room, how Amy's smile brightened whenever he entered. One morning, she found them in the kitchen before dawn, sharing coffee and quiet conversation like they'd been doing it for years. Tommy noticed too, in his own way. "Dad laughs more now," he told his Aunt Rebecca during their weekly video call. "And he doesn't look at his phone during movie night anymore." The real turning point came during a charity gala Jason had to attend. His usual date, his sister, was out of town, and somehow it felt natural to ask Amy to accompany him. She'd hesitated, aware of crossing professional boundaries, but agreed when Tommy insisted she had to go to keep Dad from being boring with business talk. That night, seeing Amy descend the stairs in a borrowed evening gown, Jason forgot how to breathe for a moment. She looked nervous but elegant, like a storybook character stepping into reality. Tommy, watching from the top of the stairs in his pajamas, gave them both a thumbs up. At the gala, Amy charmed everyone she met, her genuine warmth cutting through the usual social pretenses. Jason found himself watching her across the room, the way she listened intently to elderly Mrs. Thompson's stories, how she got the usually stern Mr. Wilson to laugh. "She's special, isn't she?" his old friend David commented, following Jason's gaze. "The way she looks at you, that's not just employee loyalty." Dancing together later that night, they'd both felt the shift. The familiar comfort of their friendship was still there, but now charged with something more. Amy's hand in his felt right, like completing a circuit neither knew was broken. "This is complicated," Amy whispered as they swayed to the music. "Tommy is happier than he's been in years," Jason finished. "Because of you, because of us together." The drive home was quiet, filled with meaningful glances and unspoken words. Standing in the foyer, neither wanting the evening to end, Jason finally found his courage. "I know this isn't simple," he said softly, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to see what this could be." Amy's answer was a small step forward, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like testing thin ice, but it felt like coming home, like finding something neither knew they were missing. That night, lying awake in their separate rooms, they both knew everything had changed. The question now was how to navigate this new territory while protecting what mattered most, Tommy's happiness and their growing sense of family. What they didn't know yet was that their budding romance would soon face a test neither could have anticipated, one that would shake the foundations of everything they were building together. The truth cracked open on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Jason sat in his home office, reviewing some routine paperwork his security team had prepared for Amy's visa renewal. Everything seemed standard until he reached the background check section. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as he read the report again and again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Annie Parker didn't exist, at least, not before 3 years ago. The woman he'd fallen in love with, who'd brought his family back to life, had been living under an assumed identity. The real shock came when he saw her true name, Rachel Wilson, his late wife Linda's younger sister. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Memories began to realign themselves with this new reality. The way Emmy sometimes looked at Tommy with tears in her eyes, how she knew exactly how to comfort him when he missed his mom, even her familiar mannerisms that he'd found so endearing. His hands shaking slightly, Jason pulled up old family photos on his computer. There she was in the background of Linda's college graduation, a teenage Rachel, her face younger but unmistakably Emmy's. How had he not seen it before? That evening, after Tommy went to bed, Jason found Amy, Rachel, in the garden, tending to their tomato plants. The sight that usually brought him peace now made his chest ache with uncertainty. "Were you ever going to tell me?" His quiet words made her freeze. When she turned, the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "Jason, her voice cracked. "I can explain." "Please do," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Explain why my son's aunt has been pretending to be someone else. Explain why you didn't tell me who you really were when I fell in love with you." Rachel sank onto the garden bench, her hands twisting in her lap. "I never meant to fall in love with you," she whispered. I needed to be close to Tommy. After Linda died, I couldn't bear the thought of him growing up without knowing any part of her family." The story spilled out like water from a broken dam. The terrible fight she'd had with Linda years ago, the guilt that had eaten at her after the accident, the fear that Jason wouldn't let her near Tommy if he knew who she really was. "Linda and we stopped speaking after I accused her then boyfriend of being dangerous," Rachel explained, tears streaming down her face. "She chose him over me, and I was so angry I missed her wedding, missed years of her life. When I heard about the crash, Jason's anger warred with compassion as he watched her break down. "The boyfriend, was it me?" "No," she shook her head quickly. Someone before you. You were the one who helped her heal from that relationship. You made her happier than I'd ever seen her. That's part of why this is so hard. Falling in love with you feels like betraying her all over again. Inside the house, a light flicked on in Tommy's room. They'd both tensed, aware of how their raised voices might carry. I should go. Rachel stood up, wiping her eyes. I understand if you want me to leave. Wait, Jason caught her arm. We're not done. Tommy adores you, the real you. And despite everything, so do I, but I need time to process this. You have every right to be angry, she said softly. But please believe that everything else, my love for Tommy, my feelings for you, that's all real. The only lie was my name. As she turned to go inside, Jason called after her. Why, Rachel? Why change your name? She paused at the door. Because every time someone called me Rachel, all I could hear was Linda's voice from our last fight, telling me I'd ruined everything. As Amy, I could be someone new, someone worthy of being in Tommy's life. That night, neither of them slept much. Jason lay awake, surrounded by memories of Linda, trying to reconcile the woman he loved and lost with this new reality. In her room, Rachel wondered if she'd lost everything again, this time through her own choices. What neither of them realized was that this revelation was just the beginning. Hidden in Rachel's past was another secret, one that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about Linda's death. The truth about that fatal plane crash was about to surface, and it would change all their lives forever. As dawn broke over the garden they built together, both Jason and Rachel faced the same question: could love built on a foundation of lies grow into something true? And more importantly, what would telling Tommy do to the delicate happiness they'd all found together? The tomato plants swayed gently in the morning breeze, their fruit ripening under the sun, unaware that the family nurturing them was about to face its greatest test yet. The days following the revelation were filled with tense silences and careful conversations. Tommy, perceptive as always, noticed the change in the house's atmosphere. Why aren't you and Amy having dinner with me anymore, Dad? He asked one evening, his fork pushing pasta around his plate. Jason's heart clenched. How do you tell a child that the woman he'd grown to trust and love was actually his aunt? That the comfort she provided wasn't just Nanny's kindness, but the love of family? Rachel, he still struggled to think of her as that, kept her distance during the day, focusing solely on Tommy. But late at night, he'd sometimes find her in the kitchen, staring at old family photos on her phone, tears silently falling. The confrontation they'd both been avoiding finally came during a thunderstorm. Tommy was asleep, and Rachel was packing her things, believing it was time to leave. Jason found her in her room, folding the clothes they'd bought together for family outings. You're running away again, he said from the doorway, just like you ran from your identity. Rachel's hands stilled on a sweater Tommy had picked out for her birthday. I'm trying to make this easier for everyone. Easier? Jason's laugh was hollow. How is disappearing from Tommy's life again easier? Haven't we had enough disappearances in this family? I never meant to, she started, but Jason cut her off. To what? To lie? To make us fall in love with you? To become so important to Tommy that losing you would break his heart all over again? Thunder crashed outside, making them both jump. In the brief silence that followed, they could hear Tommy calling out, scared by the storm. Without thinking, they both rushed to his room, colliding in the doorway. Their eyes met for a moment, years of shared care for this child passing between them. It's okay, buddy, they said in unison, then stopped awkward. Tommy looked between them, his small face scrunched in confusion. Are you fighting because of me? No, sweetheart, Rachel said, sitting on the edge of his bed. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings to figure out. Like when I'm mad and happy at the same time. Tommy asked, clutching his dinosaur plush. Jason sat down too, keeping space between himself and Rachel. Something like that, but you know what doesn't change? How much we both love you. Then why is Amy crying all the time? And why do you look sad, Dad? The simple question broke something in both of them. Rachel's hands trembled as she smoothed Tommy's blanket. Tommy, she said softly, looking at Jason for permission. When he nodded slightly, she continued, there's something I need to tell you. Something about your mom, my sister. Tommy's eyes widened. Your sister? For the next hour, as the storm raged outside, they told him a simplified version of the truth. How Rachel was his mom's sister, how she'd changed her name because of sad memories, how she'd come to be close to him because she missed her sister so much. "So, you're my aunt," Tommy processed slowly. "Like Aunt Rebecca?" "Yes, sweetie." "And you didn't tell us because you were scared." "I was wrong not to tell you," Rachel admitted. "Being scared isn't a good reason to hide the truth." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he looked at his father. "Dad, remember when I broke your special coffee mug and hid it because I was scared to tell you?" Jason nodded, starting to understand where his son was going with this. "You said everybody makes mistakes when they're scared, but family forgives each other." Tommy reached out and took both their hands. "Isn't Aunt Rachel family too?" The simple wisdom of a child cut through months of complexity. Jason looked at Rachel, really looked at her, and saw not just the lies but the love that had brought her here, the care she'd shown his son, the way she'd helped heal their broken home. "Yes," he said finally, "she is family." That night marked a turning point, but not an ending. There were still questions to be answered, trust to be rebuilt. But as they sat together, comforting Tommy through the storm, they'd felt like a family, complicated, imperfect, but real. What none of them knew was that Rachel's revelation about her identity was just the beginning. The real storm, the truth about Linda's accident, was still approaching, gathering strength like distant thunder. The heavy truth emerged one quiet Sunday afternoon. Rachel was helping Tommy organize his mom's old photos when Jason walked in, holding a dusty box he'd found in the attic. Inside were Linda's old journals and papers, things he hadn't been able to look at since the accident. "I think it's time we went through these," he said, sitting beside them. As they sorted through the papers, Rachel's hands suddenly froze on a folder marked Peter Holdings Investigation. "Jason," her voice shook, "I need to tell you something else about Linda." Tommy, sensing the tension, looked up from his photos. "Is it about Mom's accident?" Rachel nodded slowly. "Your mom. She was looking into something at work, something dangerous." Jason's face paled as he took the folder. Inside were documents about suspicious financial transactions at Peter Holdings, the company that had been trying to buy out his tech firm just before Linda's death. 2 weeks before the crash, Rachel continued, her voice barely a whisper, "Linda called me. She said she'd discovered something big, irregularities in their books, money being funneled to offshore accounts. She was going to report it." Jason's hands tightened on the papers. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "I tried." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "But without proof, they dismissed it as a grieving sister's conspiracy theory. That's when I knew I had to get closer, find the evidence Linda had mentioned. That's the real reason I became Amy." Tommy climbed into his father's lap, touching his face gently. "Dad, are you crying?" "Sometimes adults cry when they learn important things," Jason explained, holding his son close. "Your mom was very brave." They spent hours going through Linda's notes. She documented everything, suspicious meetings, coded emails, even photographs. The final entry in her journal was dated the day before her flight. "Meeting PH board tomorrow. Have to show them what I found." I was right all along. The board meeting, Jason remembered suddenly. She was flying to meet them when the plane crashed due to mechanical failure, Rachel finished bitterly. "Too convenient, don't you think?" Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, surrounded by photos of his mother. Looking at him, Jason felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. "We need to finish what Linda started." Over the next few days, they carefully pieced together Linda's investigation. Jason used his tech expertise to recover deleted emails from her old computer. Rachel reached out to her contacts in financial journalism. They discovered a complex web of fraud and corruption, with Peter Holdings at the center. But they weren't as discreet as they thought. One evening, Jason found his office ransacked. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: someone was watching. "We should stop," Rachel said that night, after they'd put Tommy to bed with extra nightlights and checks on the security system. "It's too dangerous." "That's what they want," Jason replied, holding her trembling hands. "Linda died trying to expose this. We owe it to her to finish it." Working together, they compiled the evidence: financial records, witness statements, Linda's original documents. Rachel's journalism contacts helped verify everything. Jason's legal team prepared for battle. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Wu, who'd worked for the family for years, remembered something. The day before the crash, she said, Mrs. Linda was very upset on the phone. She said something about backup files in the blue box. The blue box turned out to be a small safe hidden in Linda's old painting studio. Inside was a USB drive containing everything they needed, complete proof of Peter Holding's crimes, including evidence suggesting they'd tampered with her plane. Mom knew, Tommy said softly, looking at her last family photo. She knew they might hurt her, but she tried to stop them anyway. As they prepared to take the evidence to the authorities, Jason looked at Rachel, no longer the nanny pretending to be someone else, but a sister trying to fulfill her promise to protect her family. Linda would be proud of you, he said. Of us. What they didn't know was that their discovery would shake the business world to its core. The final chapter of their story was about to begin, one that would bring justice for Linda and peace for the family she left behind. But for now, they held each other close, their little family strengthened by truth and united by love, ready to face whatever came next. Together, the final chapter unfolded like a whirlwind. The evidence they'd gathered sparked the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. Peter Holding's top executives were arrested during an early morning raid that made headlines across the country. The truth about Linda's death finally came to light. The plane had been deliberately sabotaged on orders from those she'd been about to expose. Tommy watched the news with his father and Rachel, his small hand clutching Linda's old locket. Mom won, he said simply. The bad guys can't hurt anyone else now. The weeks that followed were intense but healing. Jason testified before federal investigators, his voice steady as he shared Linda's final discoveries. Rachel's journalist contacts helped ensure the story couldn't be buried or twisted. The truth spread like wildfire through the business world. One quiet evening, as autumn leaves danced outside their windows, Jason found Rachel in the garden. She was sitting by the tomato plants that had started it all, now heavy with ripe fruit. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, joining her on the bench. "Linda," she smiled softly. "She always loved harvest time. Remember how she'd make those ridiculous giant batches of sauce and freeze them in containers labeled love in a box?" Jason chuckled. "Tommy found one last week actually, still perfect." Their laughter faded into comfortable silence. The garden had become their sanctuary, a place where past and present could coexist peacefully. "I've been thinking," Jason said carefully, "about us, about the future." Rachel turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "Me too. This house, it's full of memories of Linda, good ones. But I think it's time to make new memories too. She'd want that for us, for Tommy." From his pocket, Jason pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I found this in Linda's things. It's a letter she wrote to Tommy just after he was born." He opened it carefully. "There's a part about you." Rachel's breath caught as he read. "If anything ever happens to me, I hope your Aunt Rachel finds her way back to you. She has the biggest heart of anyone I know, even when she's being stubborn. And I know she'll love you as fiercely as I do." Tears rolled down Rachel's cheeks. "She wrote that after our fight. She never stopped believing in you," Jason said softly, "just like I do." That weekend, they took Tommy to the beach, his first time back since the last family photo with Linda. He ran along the shore, collecting shells, while Jason and Rachel walked hand in hand behind him. "Dad, Aunt Rachel, look what I found," Tommy called, holding up a perfect sand dollar. Mom used to say these were wishes waiting to happen. They gathered around him, the three of them making a tight circle against the ocean breeze. "What should we wish for?" Rachel asked. Tommy looked between them, his face serious. "I wish we could be a real family. Not to forget Mom, but to be happy like she wanted." Jason knelt in the sand, pulling both Tommy and Rachel close. "I think we already are a family, buddy. Different from before, but just as real." That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, Jason asked Rachel to marry him. Not with a grand gesture or fancy speech, but with simple truth. "We've built something beautiful from broken pieces. Let's make it official." Tommy's whoop of joy echoed across the beach as Rachel said yes, both of them laughing and crying as he tackled them into a group hug. Later, after Tommy was asleep in their hotel room, they stood on the balcony watching the stars. You know, Rachel said, Linda once told me that love doesn't divide when you share it, it multiplies. She was right, Jason smiled, pulling her close. Our love for her made room for this new love, for our family. In the months that followed, they rebuilt their lives with purpose and joy. The garden expanded, now including Linda's favorite flowers alongside their vegetables. Tommy's laughter filled the house again, mixed with stories about his mom and new adventures with his dad and aunt-turned-stepmom. They kept Linda's memory alive, not as a shadow over their happiness, but as a light that had led them to each other. Her picture still held pride of place in their home, watching over the family she'd loved so much, a family that had grown in ways none of them could have imagined. And in the end, that was the greatest justice of all, not just the truth revealed or the wrongdoers punished, but the healing and love that had bloomed from the ashes of loss. They had become living proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories grow from the deepest heartbreak, and that family is not just about blood, but about the love we choose to give each day.